So I wanted to make a little video and talk about Mars. Now, I want to say, I'm sure many folks are probably fatigued by the news and by think pieces, but I do want to say astrology is often a really helpful tool for me when I'm thinking through complex issues. I certainly know that this week has been complicated, so I am sharing some of these thoughts with you in case they're helpful for your understanding, in case you're like me and that using astrology to think through things can be useful to you. So I share them in that spirit. If you're fatigued, I definitely think it's a good idea to ignore this post, come back to it another time. I would say in general, if you're fatigued, staying off of, you know, social media and these kinds of information overload spaces is always a good idea. At least it's a good idea for me. Anyways, obviously, I'm sure like most of you have been thinking a lot about Mars, and I wanted to share a bit of writing that I did about Mars and mundane astrology a little while ago. It's something I've talked about over the years on here. I haven't talked about it as much recently. And I want to talk about it in a context of mundane astrology. At the end of this video, we're going to look at some of this material in relationship to technique. But I do just want to say this video is really about the Mars archetype, which we know is an archetype of war and heat and aggression and all that sort of stuff. So if you don't want to talk about Mars, turn me off and go put on a sweet playlist and take yourself on a walk. Anyways, okay. And then as always, my post, this is full of my own bias. So I just want to say, so where I wanted to sort of begin is I'm sure like many of you, I've seen so many declarations, and I think from very well-meaning folks that like we shouldn't condone political violence or that we should have empathy. And while I recognize the well-meaning impulse that's often in this kind of a statement, it also reveals a skewed perspective, in my opinion. And that perspective really skews towards a selective viewpoint and a selective consideration around empathy and around violence. And I do want to say, I truly understand the desire to live in a world where we can all authentically condemn violence, right? Where we can all authentically feel empathy in the face of tragedy. That has to be all tragedy, right? And so I don't dismiss that desire. I really want to say that with my full chest. I don't dismiss that desire. It's in some ways a really noble impulse. I wish we lived in a world where, this was the case. I wish that was the world that we lived inside of. But we have to think about how empathy can't be demanded while harm remains unnamed, right? You can't ask a kid, like a little kid, to forgive a bully without first acknowledging the bruise or the humiliation, the real pain that was inflicted on the kid, right? And I would say empathy, like the marrow of empathy, it can't be selective. That's actually why it's this hugely complicated value. We can't demand empathy for only certain violences while we ignore others, right? To do so makes empathy empty. And even more so, I actually think it makes it cruel. We're in a moment where that demand for empathy is actually a kind of cruelty, in my opinion. And similarly, we can't cherry pick where we do and we don't acknowledge political violence. The violence of war is political violence. Police violence is political violence. The funding of international genocide is political violence, right? Policies that systemically erode healthcare are a kind of political violence, right? These decisions that condemn thousands of people to premature deaths, right? Political views that espouse hatred and villainize others are conduits to political violence. Political violence is so rampant. And we have to sort of, if we're going to sort of say there's no place for political violence, we have to say that for all of these, threads, this wide net that political violence casts in the United States. And what I would say for us, I'm really speaking specifically to the United States or to Americans right now, is that it's not, political violence that we just named is not just a side effect of political power. It's necessary for its functioning. We honestly, at this point, we can't afford to be so naive with our understandings of violence, especially in the United States. And so we know that in astrology, the themes of violence are deeply entrenched in the Mars archetype. So what I want to do is I want to bring back some writing that I did on Mars in the Sibly chart. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about Mars in with timing. I'm going to give you an example of this. So let's talk about the Sibly chart, right? The Sibly chart is just what you're looking at. It's one of the main charts that's used for the United States. And as you can see, it has a prominent out of sect malefic Mars and Gemini placed in the angular seventh house. If you're newer to astrology, the planet that's called the quote out of sect malefic is often a planet that can do a lot of damage or can be a real tricky spot in a natal chart. And we can extend that thinking to a mundane chart where we say Mars can really do some damage here. And personally, this Mars, the Sibly Mars, has always really fascinated me as a way of thinking through American identity. Um, it's one of the reasons I love the Sibly chart, right? Many people have different feelings about what chart to use. And Sibly is one that's popular and everyone doesn't use it, but this Mars placement has always made a lot of sense to me. If we think of Mars domains of war and conflict, aggression, masculinity, and defense, I certainly think in the United States, those are the themes that we have a really hard time with, right? Or that are big glaring mistakes that we often are stuck inside of or cut by. And when we're thinking about Mars, just generally, it's important to say that malefics are not all bad, right? But they do bring challenging context. So in some lights, we might see Mars as like a really capable athlete, all this vigor. We might see it as a sort of a noble soldier or a warrior, a hero or a defender. And then in other lights, Mars is more of a bully. It's an abuser. It's a warmonger, right? And we have to really hold both. So in the Sibly chart, we can see that Mars, as the out of sect malefic, might be teetering into some of the challenging territory. Now, like I said, it's in the position of the seventh house. And what I want to start talking about is its square to an angular 10th house Neptune. Now, we are weaving in modern astrology here. By and large, I talk mostly about traditional stuff when it comes to these techniques. And so we're going to take a detour and add in some of our modern planets, but I think it's a really useful way of blending them in. So we know that Neptune is a planet that intoxicates. It brings floods of inebriating water at its best. Neptune rains down a kind of spiritual altruism or a romantic haze. At its best, it's got this kind of dreaminess, but at its worst, it is in illusion. Like it obliterates sober reality with dangerous fantasy. It casts delusion onto the world around it. And so just for a moment, if we're thinking about this Mars square with Neptune, let's think about these two energies combining. How does the warrior mix with the planet of illusion? How might masculinity as a martial force become corrupted by a kind of toxic fantasy? And to my estimation, to my eyes, Mars makes pretty dangerous bedfellows with Neptune, right? The planet that holds the weapon becomes irresponsibly swayed by Neptune's inebriating kind of games of make believe. Neptune obscures Mars's aim and casts shadows and little fantasies for Mars to kind of wildly swing its sword at, right? I wrote here, under Neptune's influence, the drunken warrior sees enemies everywhere. It creates a religion out of war. Now, culturally, the US's particular flavor of masculinity, we really know this right now, kind of seems to huff this martial Neptunian gas, right? Even the phrase toxic masculinity is just sort of like a part of the culture at this point. It's a very clear Mars Neptune word. There's this delusion of virility and heroics that kind of infuses a lot of the American landscape, that kind of cowboy that has intoxicated the American imagination for so long. And then another place that I've always found it really interesting is that we create these fantasy wars. We make these fantasy opponents, and then we couch everything in this language of battle, this language of war, right? We have wars on drugs, wars on poverty, right? And these are really, really strange places to invoke the archetype of Mars, right? These are very strange opponents to name and like stoke the fire of Mars around. Like if we think of like a war on poverty, how is someone dealing with being unhoused? Like why do we need to bring the language of war into that? Or someone who is struggling with addiction, why do we need to bring the language of war into that? In fact, I think it's probably counterproductive, right? I think many of you would probably agree. We can think about the US history of war, right? It's a very shocking fact that it's like, the US has only not been at war for 17 years of its history. It's a startling and a sober fact, especially when we contend with the fact that so much of that blood and warfare has been and continues to be shed overseas. It is removed from the eyes of the average American. They don't have to contend with how pronounced this angular Mars is on the chart. Um, but even at home, right, we're also kind of shy away from the martial impacts, right? Whether it's about really contending with the indigenous genocide that is our founding, the nightmarish reality of the Atlantic slave trade, how that has morphed into other systems of martial exploitative violence on Black populations, right? Our addiction to this crazy addiction to ever increasing innovations in guns and the very particular American plague of mass shootings, right? If we look at all of this together, it is clear that we in the United States have a very serious Mars problem, right? Now, we all know that the Mars issues have been, will stay on display in gut-wrenching just detail. And what I would just say is it's really hard to hear a politician say something like violence has no place in politics or in the United States, because we know, if we just have our eyes open, that this is an aggressive and a cruel distortion, right? The US project is built and thrives through political violence. So I say all of this because, I think we're in a real, very Mars, we're at a real crisis moment about accepting some of this in terms of national identity. That Mars archetype has swollen into this kind of festering boil of heat and intensity. And I think all of us kind of feel that sense of, okay, where are we going to go from here? And in general, one of the things that's really important, I think, in astrology, and why I like thinking through astrology, is that I can have this knee-jerk response where I say, okay, well, then let's get rid of Mars. Let's get rid of the Mars archetype. And even though we might not like that, like the truth, we can't get rid of the Mars archetype. The topic of Mars, the energy of Mars, the archetype of Mars is a crucial and huge part of the world that we live in, and a necessary part of life. But I like to remember, or I like to think about it in the sense that Mars is a really young energy, right? If we're thinking about it purely archetypally, it's that sort of, invigorated warrior athlete, full of energy Mars, right? It's youthful and young. And that youthful naivete tends to get really seduced by stories of heroes and villains. And when we're thinking about the best of Mars from an astrological perspective, that would be Mars in Capricorn. That is where Mars is exalted. And so it's Mars inside Saturn's domain. It's Mars being tended to by Saturn, right? It gives it discipline and structure. And the discipline and structure is so important for the planet that holds the weapon, because that will minimize collateral damage if we have to use Mars sword, right? So I'd say I share all of this as a way for each of us to think through the Mars archetype, right? Some of us will need to really sit with the fact that like Mars actually has to exist. We have to find a place for masculinity and for force and for all these martial things. Where do we move it in ways where there's no collateral damage? And for others of us, we have to sort of sober up from the fantasy of the Mars winners and losers and us against them, and then connecting it to the great hypocrisy that is hearing people sort of say there's no place for violence in politics in the United States, or even a kind of desire for a shallow empathy. So I want us to look at an example as a quick transition. I hope, let me actually say this before I go into the stuff. I share all of this with you, hoping that it is something that helps you make sense of where we're at. So I send love and care to you and to yours. Now, this is that Mars that we're talking about, right? This is the Sibly chart. So what we're going to do now is look at combining some traditional mundane techniques to see a period when this Mars is really active. Now, I am not going to do current astrology. I don't want to do the doom and gloom. I will be in the next little while talking about, and I already have been, right? I made that post yesterday about how the Aries eclipse of 2024 is in what Ptolemy calls the intensification period. I've talked about how we are using circumambulations of the triplicity lord shift about to have Saturn square, but I don't want to talk about stuff that's happening right now. I think I want to use the retroactive glance of astrology to understand how it works in a conversation about time. So what we're going to look at is the Sibly chart. We're going to weave it into some of the techniques that we use in mundane astrology. If you are new here or you have not encountered any of the mundane techniques, the Friends of Dorotheus student group has gone through some of this. I do want to say this is complicated material, so I'm going to do my best to keep it pretty simple, or as simple as I can. And what we're going to be looking at is root charts for relevant Jupiter Saturn conjunction. So this material that I'm showing you guys is based on Abu Mashar's amazing book, The Books of Religions and Dynasties, sometimes called On the Great Conjunctions. And what I've just done here is put up the 4 relevant root charts for the Civil War. Now, I am writing a much longer piece about this period of time and these techniques, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I do just want to look at how we talked about Mars and connect it to a period where we saw a saturation of the martial force of war and even some of the problems of Mars as we sit inside them now. So inner wheel is the Sibly chart. We still have this Mars in Gemini. What this second wheel is the 1802 triplicity shift ingress, right? Abu Mashar lets us know that we can follow the cycles of Jupiter and Saturn into idealized periods that are 960 years, 240 years, and 20 years. So imagine those circles all nested inside each other. For our purposes, we're just looking at 240, 20, and then a single year. But start thinking about it that way. We would say that like one chart is a root that starts in 1802, and then we would look at Time Lords and how it grows and moves through time. One chart is a root that starts in 1861, and we look at how that grows through time, and then we'll look at the year 1865 when the Civil War ends. So the very first thing that I just want to say is we're going to limit our data. I'm going to make this as simple as I can, and we're going to focus on 2 points that we know, and Abu Mashar would also tell us, are very important. We are investigating Mars, so we're going to think about Mars, and then we're going to look at the lot of fortune and the ascendant as being important, potent points that tell us where the topic of the year has arrived, or the topic of the period of time has arrived. So the very first thing that I want to say is if we look at Mars in the Sibly chart, and then we connect it to the story of the 1802 chart, which lasts from 1802 until 2000. All of the idealized Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that happened in the Earth element from 1802 to 2000 are included in this chart. And we can see that the lot of fortune, a very, very important point that's about contexts of compulsory happening, right, is right on the Sibly Mars. Then if we look at the 1861 chart, which is the relevant Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that happened at that the Civil War beginning starts inside of, we can see that the ascendant is kind of pointing right towards the Sibly Mars. Many of you will know that 1861 is the year when the Civil War officially broke out. So it makes sense to sort of say, okay, there's a strong martial component there. And then our outer wheel here is 1865, when we know that the Civil War actually comes to a close. And very interestingly, we can see an almost exact Mars return in that year, and the topics of the year, the ascendant of that year, being brought to Mars. Now, it's interesting because this is a cessation of war, right? This will be the end of the war. We know that it doesn't, that the war is happening for a large part of 1865. But I also think it's really interesting if we connect this to a specific martial problem in the United States, which is the prison industrial complex and the police. We know that the 13th Amendment, which is one of the things that happens in 1865, it calls for the abolition of slavery, but has a very important and just cruel subtext that says except for in when someone is incarcerated, right? So we see the seeds of a very violent for-profit prison industrial complex that will take root here. Like I said, I'm writing about a lot of this in other spaces, so I'm not going to do a ton of it here. What I really want you to get a sense of is look at the saturation of how when we add the Sibly Mars, we add the Sibly chart in and think about Mars, we connect it to our Time Lords. We see a saturation of impact that really show us the Mars archetype. So I hope this was interesting for you. I'm going to be sharing more and more of these techniques. If you have thoughts, questions, please feel free to post them. It's my pleasure to make this stuff make sense. And more than anything, it's a time, and I send love to you and to yours. I really, truly hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you're taking care of your people and extending that, circumference of who your people are. I hope you are letting your people care for you. And I hope that together you are all finding ways to take care of your little corner of the world. I send love and gratitude to you for your attention. Thank you.